Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to tell you how the nuns were able to find peace and sleep in snowy, desolate monasteries. Sit back, close your eyes, and get ready to drift off to sleep in peace. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Imagine a woman arriving on foot at the gates of a remote stone monastery, snow falling silently around her, carrying nothing but the clothes she wears and a past the medieval world had taught her to be ashamed of. For centuries, one of the more overlooked chapters of medieval religious history involves institutions built specifically to receive women exactly like her. Former prostitutes seeking a formal, sanctioned path out of a life the church considered sinful, but never entirely irredeemable. These were not myths or later inventions. They were real, documented religious houses, some founded by prominent medieval reformers, others growing more informally around individual communities, all sharing a common purpose: to offer women leaving prostitution a structured, disciplined, and often genuinely alternative existence within monastic walls. The question this account explores is not simply where these women went, but how, given the harsh physical conditions many of these remote monasteries operated under, particularly in colder regions and seasons, women who had already endured a life of hardship and social rejection found any real measure of peace, rest, and eventual sleep within walls that offered discipline and redemption, but rarely comfort in any modern sense of the word. Chapter 2: A Reformer and His Radical Idea. The most significant and well-documented figure behind formal religious institutions for reformed prostitutes was Robert of Arbrissel, a charismatic itinerant preacher active in Western France in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, whose preaching reportedly included former prostitutes, among many other more marginalized and penitent individuals drawn to his message of radical humility and reform. Around the year Namamban, Robert founded the Abbey of Fontevraud, an institution structured in a genuinely unusual way for its time, organized as a double monastery housing both men and women under the ultimate authority of a female abbess, with specific communities within the broader complex dedicated to receiving women with pasts the medieval church considered particularly in need of penance, including former prostitutes. Historical sources describing Fontevraud's early history indicate that Robert deliberately sought out and welcomed such women rather than treating their presence as merely tolerated, a genuinely notable stance within the broader context of medieval attitudes that frequently treated former prostitutes with lasting suspicion even after a formal religious conversion. Fontevraud grew into one of the most significant and enduring religious institutions in medieval France, eventually serving as a burial site for members of the English royal Plantagenet dynasty, though its origins remained rooted in Robert of Arbrissel's specific and, for his era, unusually inclusive vision of who deserved a genuine path toward spiritual redemption. Chapter 3: the order that bears her name. Beyond Fontainebleau, a more specifically dedicated institutional movement developed across 13th century Europe under the name the Order of Saint Mary Magdalene, sometimes referred to by the German term Magdalenerinnen in regions where the order established significant houses, particularly within German-speaking territories. These communities, formally recognized by the papacy in the early 13th century, existed specifically to receive former prostitutes into a structured religious life, following the Augustinian rule, a monastic framework emphasizing communal living, obedience, and disciplined daily religious observation. The choice of Mary Magdalene as the order's namesake reflected a well-established medieval Christian tradition, itself resting on a conflation of several distinct biblical and hagiographic figures that modern biblical scholarship treats with considerable caution, which had come to associate Mary Magdalene broadly with the theme of a penitent former sinner who achieved genuine spiritual transformation and closeness to Christ, making her a natural patron figure for institutions built around exactly this narrative of redemption. Houses of this order spread across France, Germany, and other parts of medieval Europe, with historical records indicating considerable variation in the size, resources, and specific local character of individual houses, some flourishing with significant patronage, and endowment, others operating under considerably more modest and materially difficult circumstances, particularly those established in more remote or economically marginal regions where winter conditions could be genuinely severe. Chapter 4. A Life Governed by the Bell. Life within these penitential religious houses followed the same basic structural framework common to medieval monasticism generally, a daily schedule organized around the canonical hours, fixed times of communal prayer, marked throughout the day and night by the ringing a bell, beginning with the night office of matins, often observed in the deep hours before dawn, through to complline, the final prayer service marking the close of the day before the community retired to sleep. This structure imposed a genuinely demanding rhythm on residents, since the night office in particular required wired rising from sleep in the middle of the night, a practice common across medieval monasticism, but one that placed additional physical dawn demand on women, whose bodies, in many documented cases, already carried the accumulated toll of the harder life that he had left behind before entering religious life. Beyond formal prayer, daily life typically included assigned manual labor, whether textile work, garden cultivation, or other productive tasks common to medieval religious communities, alongside periods of required silence and formal instruction in religious doctrine and scripture, a comprehensive daily structure designed explicitly to replace the disorder the Church associated with the women's previous lives with the disciplined, orderly rhythm considered essential to genuine spiritual reform. Chapter 5. Cold Stone and Careful Preparation. The physical buildings that housed these communities were, like virtually all medieval monastic architecture, built primarily from stone, a material chosen for durability and fire resistance, but one that offered relatively poor natural insulation against cold compared to the timber and thatch. Construction more common in ordinary peasant housing discussed in other historical accounts of this period. Monasteries situated in colder regions or higher elevations, and those established with more modest resources, rather than the wealth and patronage enjoyed by houses like Fontevraud, faced genuine seasonal hardship from harsh winter care conditions and surviving monastic various medieval. Religious communities do document real concern over adequate heating, particularly within the specific room known as the calefactory, a single warm and common room that many medieval monasteries maintained as one of the only heated spaces within an otherwise largely unheated stone complex. Individual dormitory cells and the main church itself typically received little or no heating, even during the coldest months. Residents relied on layered wool clothing and bedding, techniques of insulation and warmth management, broadly consistent with those employed by medieval society generally during severe winters, though monastic rules governing personal possessions and simplicity of dress sometimes limited the degree to which individual residents could accumulate the kind of substantial larded bedding a wealthier peasant household might assemble, meaning physical cold remained a genuine and largely unavoidable feature of monastic winter lives most of medieval Europe. Chapter 6: Interrupted rest and its purpose. Sleep within a medieval monastic community, including the penitential houses this account focuses on, was deliberately structured rather than continuous, a genuinely significant departure from ordinary lay sleeping patterns, and one directly connected to the broader spiritual purpose these institutions served. The requirement to rise for matins in the middle of the night, followed by return to sleep before the early morning offices resumed, produced what modern sleep historians studying medieval monastic practice describe as a segmented sleep pattern dividing the night into two distinct sleep periods, separated by a period of wakeful prayer, a practice medieval monastic communities understood not as a hardship to be minimized, but as a spiritually meaningful discipline in its own right, connecting nighttime wakefulness to biblical and devotional traditions, emphasizing vigilance and prayer during the hours when the wider world slept. For women who had left behind lives frequently marked by disrupted, unsafe, or exploitative nighttime circumstances, this new form of structured, commonly observed nighttime wakefulness, however physically demanding, offered something genuinely different in character, a nighttime experience defined by shared purpose and physical safety within an enclosed and protected community, rather than the vulnerability and danger that had characterized their previous circumstances. A distinction historians studying these institutions' own surviving records suggest mattered considerably to how residents themselves came to understand and experience this demanding nightly rhythm. Chapter 7: Prayer as a Path to Come. Beyond the practical structure of the monastic schedule, these specific spiritual and devotional practices, these communities emphasized offered residents tools historians studying medieval religious psychology suggest were genuinely effective within the framework of period appropriate understanding for managing anxiety, shame, and the psychological aftermath of the difficult circumstances many residents had experienced before entering religious life. Regular, structured confession, a central feature of medieval Augustinian and broader modern monastic religious practice, provided residents a formal, repeated opportunity to voice and release guilt and distress within a framework the community understood as leading toward genuine absolution and spiritual relief, a practice modern historians of medieval religious life note bears meaningful, if obviously not identical resemblance to structured psychological processing techniques recognized in later eras, even though medieval religious communities themselves understood and articulated the practice in exclusively theological rather than psychological terms. The communal recitation and chanting of the divine office, the formal cycle of psalms and prayers observed throughout the day and night, provided a steady, repetitive, and communally shared rhythm that surviving monastic writings frequently describe in terms of the calm and settled state of mind. Such regular devotional practice was intended to cultivate, offering residents a structured framework for processing difficult emotion within the specific theological vocabulary and praxis available to medieval religious communities of this period. Chapter 8: A Community Bound by Shared History. One of the most significant and historically documented features of these specific penitential institutions, distinguishing them from ordinary medieval convents, drawing novices primarily from wealthy or noble families, was the fact that residents shared a broadly similar prior life experience, genuine basis for mutual understanding and solidarity that historians studying surviving records from houses of the Order of Saint Mary Magdalene and similar institutions suggest played a meaningful role in how residents adjusted to and experienced communal religious life. Surviving records from various houses indicate that some communities developed internal leadership structures, specifically staffed by longer tenured residents who had themselves previously lived the same life. Newer arrivals were transitioning away from a structure that provided newcomers with guidance from women who could offer understanding grounded in genuinely shared experience rather than the more distant theoretical sympathy a conventionally raised nobleman entering religious life from an entirely different background might have been able to offer. This shared foundation should not be romanticized into an assumption that these communities were free of internal tension or difficulty. Since surviving monastic records do document instances of conflict, resistance to the strict discipline required, and in some documented cases, residents, ultimately left these communities rather than complete a full transition to permanent religious life. A reminder that the path this account describes, however genuinely available, was neither easy nor universally successful for every woman who attempted it. Chapter 9. The Stories Behind the Ideal. The theological and cultural framework that made these institutions possible drew heavily on established hagiographic traditions surrounding specific figures already discussed in other historical accounts of this period, most notably Mary of Egypt and Ypres and Thais, whose stories of dramatic conversion from a life of prostitution to profound religious devotion compose and circulated across the early medieval Christian world, provided the narrative and theological template later institutions like Fontevraud and the Order of Saint Mary Marianne explicitly drew upon and referenced in their own founding documents and internal religious instruction. Modern historians, while treating the specific narrative details of these earlier hagiographic accounts with the appropriate scholarly caution regarding their historical accuracy as literal biography, recognize their genuine and significant influence on how medieval religious institutions and the women who entered them understood and articulated the possibility of redemption, providing residents entering houses like those of the Magdalene order with an established, culturally recognized narrative framework through which to understand and give meaning to their own personal transition, a genuinely significant psychological and spiritual resource within the specific religious worldview medieval Christian society operated within. Regardless of the more complicated historical relationship between the hagiographic trigraphic tradition and verifiable historical fact that modern scholarship has since clarified. Chapter 10. What Remained When the Snow Melted. By the close of the medieval period, institutions dedicated to retrieving reformed prostitutes had become an established, if never especially large, feature of the broader European religious landscape, their model persisting in modified form into later centuries through successor institutions such as the various Magdalene asylums and refuges that continued operating across Europe well into the modern era, institutions whose later history, particularly from the 18th century onward, developed a considerably more troubled and, in some documented later cases, genuinely coercive character that stands in notable contrast to the more voluntary, reform-oriented framework this account has focused on within the specifically medieval period. Within their original medieval context, however, the surviving evidence suggests these institutions offered a genuine, if demanding and materially austere, alternative path for women navigating a society that otherwise offered them very little beyond the identity and circumstances they were attempting to leave behind, a structured environment where the physical hardship of cold stone walls and interrupted sleep existed alongside all form of communal solidarity, spiritual practice, and shared purpose that for at least some of the women who walked through those monastery gates seeking exactly this, appears from the historical record to have provided something genuinely closer to the peace they had come there seeking than anything the wider medieval world beyond those walls had been willing. Chapter 11. The Daughters of God in Paris. Among the most well-documented specific institutions of this type was the house known as the Filles Dieu, or Déesses Dieu, or Daughters of God, established in Paris during the early 13th century, reportedly with direct involvement and support from King Louis IX, whose personal piety and interest in religious reform is well documented across numerous historical sources describing his reign. The Filles Dieu operated under a structure broadly consistent with the Augustinian framework common to similar institutions elsewhere in Europe. And surviving Messian municipal and ecclesiastical records provide historians with a somewhat more detailed picture of this particular house's daily operation and population than survives for many smaller or less prominent penitential communities established during the same general period. Royal and municipal patronage of this kind proved significant to the institution's material stability, since houses receiving consistent support from wealthy or politically significant patrons generally maintained better physical conditions, including more reliable heating and provisioning during difficult winter months than penitential houses operating with more limited or uncertain financial backing in smaller towns or more remote regions. Filles Dieu continued operating in Paris for several centuries following its founding, its long institutional history offering historians a useful case study in how a single penitential community adapted and persisted across the considerable social, religious, and political changes that swept through French society between the 13th century and the eventual transformation or closure of many such medieval religious institutions in later centuries. Chapter 12. The Convertites of Renaissance Italy. Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Rome, developed their own distinct tradition of institutions for reformed prostitutes, generally known by the Italian term convertite, meaning leaning literally the converted, with documented houses established and operating from the medieval period through and beyond the Renaissance era in several major Italian urban centers. Venice's documented convertite house, established with recorded civic and ecclesiastical support, operated within a specific urban context shaped by the city's substantial and well-documented commercial sex trade, itself connected to Venice's prominent position as a major Mediterranean trading center, meaning the Venetian institution existed within a somewhat different social and an economic environment than penitential houses, is established in smaller or less commercially significant towns elsewhere in medieval Europe. Roman convertite institutions, similarly documented across several centuries, received support at various points from papal patronage, reflecting the specific religious significance the papacy attached to institutions embodying the theme of penitential redemption within the city, considered the center of the broader Catholic Christian world. These Italian institutions, like their counterparts elsewhere in Europe, combined the same basic elements already described in earlier chapters: structured communal religious life, manual labor, and formal religious instruction. Though surviving Italian records indicate meaningful local variation in the specific balance between voluntary entry and, in some later documented periods, extending beyond the strictly medieval time frame, this account primarily focuses increasing institutional and social pressure placed upon women to enter such houses rather than the more purely voluntary framework. Robert of Arbrissel's original vision at Fontainebleau had emphasized. Chapter 13: Who Paid for Redemption? The financial foundation supporting penitential religious houses varied considerably depending on the specific institution, its location, and the nature of its patronage, a variation that directly affected the material conditions, including the adequacy of winter heating and provisioning, residents actually experienced. Wealthier and more prominently patronized institutions, such as Fontainebleau, with its eventual royal connections, or the Parisian Philistine, under direct royal support, generally maintained more substantial and reliable funding through landed endowments, regular donations from wealthy patrons seeking spiritual merit through such charitable support, and in some cases, income generated through the institution's own agricultural land holdings or craft production. Smaller or more remote houses, lacking this kind of print of prominent patronage, often depended more heavily on local diocesan support, smaller individual donations, and the direct productive labor of residents themselves, an economic reality that created a genuine and documented disparity in material conditions between well-endowed institutions and their more modestly resourced counterparts, particularly evident during the difficult winter months. This account has emphasized throughout its broader examination of medieval cold and survival. Medieval Christian theology generally framed charitable donation to institutions caring for penitent sinners as a genuinely meritorious spiritual act, providing wealthy donors a theological incentive to support such houses, though the practical, uneven distribution of this charitable support across different institutions meant that a resident's actual material experience of penitential religious life could depend considerably on which specific house, shaped by the accident of local patronage and regional wealth. Chapter 14: Looking in from outside the walls. Medieval society's broader attitude toward these penitential institutions and the women who entered them was genuinely complex and, based on surviving historical sources, frequently inconsistent, reflecting the wider tension in medieval Christian thought between theological ideals, emphasizing the possibility of genuine redemption and persistent social stigma that often continued to shape how former prostitutes were regarded, even after formal religious conversion. Some surviving medieval sources, including sermons and religious writings, praise a specific virtue of institutions, offering this path toward redemption in genuinely admiring terms. Framing the reformed prostitute turned devoted religious resident as a powerful and theologically significant example of Christian mercy and transformation. Other surviving sources, including certain legal and municipal records from various medieval towns, reveal more ambivalent or openly suspicious attitudes, with some local authorities and communities expressing concern or hesitation about penitential houses established in close proximity to their own settlements, reflecting a persistent undercurrent of social distrust that formal religious conversion did not always fully overcome in the eyes of the wider medieval public. This documented inconsistency between elevated theological ideal and more grounded social reality represents an important and historically accurate complication who any overly simplified narrative suggesting medieval society uniformly celebrated or fully embraced these institutions and the women within them are more honest picture that acknowledges genuine variation in how contemporaries actually responded to this particular expression of medieval religious and social reform. Chapter 15: Women Who Governed Women. A genuinely distinctive feature of many penitential institutions, and one connecting them to broader patterns within medieval female family monasticism more generally, was the significant governing authority held by abbess or prioress leading the community, a position of real institutional power within a broader medieval society that otherwise offered women relatively limited formal authority in most other social and religious contexts. At Fontevraud specifically, Robert of Arbrissel's founding structure placed the entire double monastery, including its male religious community, under the ultimate governing authority of a feudal abba female abbess, a genuinely notable and historically significant arrangement that surviving documentation confirms was maintained as an ongoing institutional principle throughout much of the abba's subsequent history, rather than existing merely as a temporary founding arrangement. The specific women who held these leadership positions across various penitential houses came from varied backgrounds, some documented as having themselves entered religious life through the same penitential path as the broader community they eventually came to lead, others arriving from more conventional noble or ecclesiastical backgrounds before assuming leadership of communities whose residents had followed considerably different life paths before entering religious life. This structure of female governance carried genuine practical consequence for daily community life, since decisions regarding daily schedule, resource allocation, discipline, and the community's relationship with external ecclesiastical and secular authorities rested substantially with these women leaders, making the specific character, judgment, and priorities of an individual abbess a significant factor shaping the actual lived experience residents of any particular penitential house encountered. Chapter 16. A pattern repeated across Northern Europe. Beyond the specific French and Italian institutions already discussed, documented penitential houses for reformed prostitutes appeared across a considerable range of medieval European regions, including German-speaking territories where houses of the Order of Saint Mary Magdalene, discussed in an earlier chapter, established a meaningful institutional presence across several cities and towns, as well as documented examples in England and other parts of Northern Europe, operating under somewhat varied local names and specific institutional structures while sharing the same broad underlying purpose. This wider geographic pattern reflects the genuinely pan-European character of the theological and social framework driving this particular form of medieval religious institution, rather than representing an isolated phenomenon confined to a single region or specific founding figure's immediate sphere of direct influence. Regional variation in climate meaningfully shaped the practical winter experience residents of these different houses, as actually faced with institutions established in the colder regions of Germany, northern France, and England generally confronting more severe and sustained winter conditions than houses located in the milder Mediterranean climate of Italian cities such as Rome, a genuine environmental variation that meant the specific physical hardship this account's central question it addresses was not experienced uniformly across every documented penitential institution, but varied considerably depending on an individual house's specific geographic location and the particular severity of winters in that region during the medieval period its account has situated its within. Chapter 17. Slow changes across the later medieval centuries. As the medieval period progressed toward its later centuries, documented penitential institutions for reformed prostitutes underwent gradual institutional evolution, reflecting broader changes affecting medieval monasticism generally. On monastic populations and resources across Europe, and evolving theological and pastoral approaches to sin, penance, and religious reform within the broader late medieval church. Some originally more purely voluntary penitential houses appear, based on surviving later medieval records, to have gradually incurably incorporated elements of external pressure or municipal direction in determining who entered such institutions. A documented shift away from Robert of Arbrissell's original emphasis on freely chosen spiritual transformation toward arrangements in some cases more directly connected to civic efforts at regulating and controlling urban prostitution through institutional confinement rather than purely voluntary religious. This gradual evolution, while genuinely significant and historically documented, should not be read as erasing the earlier, more voluntary character these institutions had generally maintained during their original founding centuries, but rather understood as an important later development, illustrating how medieval institutions of this kind continued adapting, not always in a straightforwardly positive direction, across the several centuries, separating their original founding from the eventual, more dramatic transformation these institutions would undergo in subsequent early, modern, and modern periods. Chapter 18: The Path Toward a Different Kind of Institution. The medieval penitential houses this account has focused on represent only the earliest chapter in a considerably longer institutional history, one that continued, in modified and increasingly distinct form, well beyond the medieval period, into the early modern and eventually modern eras, producing institutions historians generally refer to collectively as Magdalen asylums or Magdalen homes, established across various European countries and, eventually, in some of their colonial territories, from the 18th century onward. These later institutions, while drawing on the same underlying theological tradition, and even, in some cases, the same Mary Magdalene namesake already discussed in earlier chapters, operated within a considerably different social and institutional context than their medieval predecessors. Increasingly shaped by evolving 18th and 19th century attitudes toward poverty, female sexuality, and institutional social control that differed meaningfully from the specific medieval religious framework Robert of Arbrissel and similar founders had originally operated within. Historians studying this longer institutional history generally emphasize that the transition from the medieval model, this account, has primarily examined to the later, more institutionally rigid Magdalen asylum model, was gradual and uneven rather than representing a single clean break. But eventual later institutions that emerged from this longer historical trajectory would come to bear increasingly limited resemblance to the more voluntary, reform-oriented medieval framework this account's earlier chapters have described in detail. Chapter 19: A Harder History to Tell. Honest historical treatment of this broader institutional tradition requires acknowledging directly that the later Magdalen asylums, particularly those operating in Ireland and the United Kingdom from the 18th century through, in a small number of documented cases, as late as the closing years of the 20th century, developed a genuinely troubled and, according to extensive documented testimony and subsequent government inquiry, frequently abusive institutional character that stands in significant and important contrast to the more voluntary medieval framework this account has primarily examined. These later institutions, particularly the Irish Magdalen laundries, documented extensively through both survivor testimony and formal government investigation conducted in recent decades, are well established through this documentation to have frequently operated through coercive confinement rather than voluntary entry, involving forced unpaid labor, harsh discipline, and conditions. Subsequent official inquiry has characterized as involving genuine and serious mistreatment of the women and girls held within them, a documented historical reality entirely distinct in character from the more voluntary spiritual reform this account's earlier medieval chapters have described. Acknowledging this later, considerably darker institutional history matters for historical honesty, since presenting only the more sympathetic medieval origin story, this account has primarily focused on, without recognizing how dramatically the underlying institutional model eventually deteriorated. In certain later contexts and centuries, would offer an incomplete and potentially misleading picture of this institution's full and considerably more complicated overall historical arc. Chapter 20: Two Histories Under One Name. Understanding the full historical scope, this account has traced from Robert of Arbrissell's genuinely reform-minded founding of Fontevraud in Yvornevlin through the documented later troubles of the modern Magdalen asylums closing only in the final years of the 20th century, require us holding to distinct historical realities in view simultaneously without collapsing one into the other. The medieval penitential houses this account has primarily examined appear, based on this specific surviving evidence available from that earlier period, to have generally offered women a genuinely voluntary, if materially demanding and physically austere, alternative path shaped by authentic period theological conviction regarding the possibility of redemption, a historical reality reflected in the cold stone walls, interrupted nighttime prayer, and communal solidarity. This account's earlier chapters have described in detail the considerably later institutions operating under similar names and drawing on the same underlying religious tradition, particularly from the 18th century onward, developed into something historically distinct and, according to extensive later documentation, frequently coercive and harmful in character, a genuinely different institutional reality that later centuries produced from originally similar theological roots. Recognizing both realities, honestly, without either erasing the genuine medieval history of reform-minded institutional care this account began with, or minimizing the documented later harm subsequent centuries produced under a superficially similar institutional name, offers the most historically accurate and responsible way of understanding this long, complicated, and ultimately two-part story spanning nearly 9 centuries of European religious and social history.